When contractors renovated the basement of the old Blackwood Institute in 1923, they discovered something that would haunt the small town of Millhaven, Pennsylvania, forever. Beneath the rotting floorboards of what was once Dr. Cornelius Theophilus's private treatment room, they found the skeletal remains of 17 patients, each bearing signs of crude surgical procedures to the skull. In 1847, Dr. Cornelius Theophilus arrived in Millhaven with impeccable credentials from the University of Edinburgh and promises of revolutionary treatments for diseases of the mind. The townspeople welcomed him with open arms, desperate for someone who could help their afflicted family members. What they didn't know was that they had invited a monster into their midst, one whose hunger for scientific advancement would transform their quiet community into a charnel house of failed experiments and buried secrets. The Blackwood Institute for Mental Rehabilitation opened its doors on October 13, 1848. A date that local newspapers would later call the beginning of Millhaven's darkest chapter. The three-story brick building sat on the outskirts of town, surrounded by dense woodland that seemed to swallow the screams that would echo from its windows for the next 2 decades. Dr. Theophilus was a man of striking appearance, tall and gaunt, with piercing gray eyes that seemed to look through rather than at his patients. Those who met him described his presence as both magnetic and deeply unsettling. He spoke in measured tones about the revolutionary science of phrenology and his groundbreaking methods for treating what he called malformations of the cerebral matter. The good doctor's methods were, by his own account, far ahead of their time. While other physicians relied on restraints and cold water treatments, Theophilus claimed to have developed surgical techniques that could physically correct the abnormalities in his patients' brains. He published papers in obscure European journals describing procedures that involved precise incisions into the skull and the insertion of various instruments to realign the humors of the mind. What made Dr. Theophilus particularly dangerous was not just his methods, but his ability to convince families that his treatments offered hope where none existed before. Martha Whitmore brought her son Edmund to the Institute in the spring of 1849. Edmund had suffered what we would now recognize as severe depression following the death of his fiancée in a carriage accident. Martha later wrote in her diary, which was discovered in the town's historical society. Dr. Theophilus examined Edmund for nearly an hour, running his fingers along his skull like a blind man reading scripture. He spoke of pressure points and cranial irregularities with such authority that I found myself believing that my son's melancholy truly was a physical ailment that could be cured. The treatment regimen at Blackwood Institute was shrouded in secrecy. Families were told that the delicate nature of the procedures required complete isolation from outside influences. Visiting days were rare and strictly controlled. When parents and spouses were permitted to see their loved ones, they were shown patients in a controlled environment. A pleasant parlor room where the more presentable patients sat quietly, often appearing sedated but peaceful. What happened in the basement treatment rooms was an entirely different matter. Dr. Theophilus had converted the underground chambers into what he called his surgical theater. The walls were lined with shelves containing an array of medical instruments, many of his own design. Crude drawings and notes covered every available surface, depicting cross-sections of human skulls with detailed annotations about pressure release points and cranial rebalancing techniques. The doctor's assistant, Hans Müllner, was a German immigrant who had arrived in America under mysterious circumstances. Müller spoke little English and seemed to exist solely to carry out Theophilus's orders. Local residents described him as having dead eyes and hands that were permanently stained with what appeared to be blood, though Mueller claimed it was merely medical iodine. By 1851, the Blackwood Institute had gained a reputation throughout Pennsylvania and neighboring states. Families desperate for solutions to their relatives' mental afflictions traveled hundreds of miles to seek out Dr. Theophilus's expertise. The waiting list for admission stretched months into the future, and the doctor commanded fees that would be equivalent to tens of thousands of dollars today. But something was terribly wrong at Blackwood Institute. Patients who entered the facility rarely emerged, and those who did were often fundamentally changed in ways that their families struggled to comprehend. Sarah Hartwell's husband Thomas was admitted to the Institute in September 1851 for what Dr. Theophilus diagnosed as acute cerebral inflammation. Thomas had been prone to violent outbursts and periods of confusion following a head injury sustained in a mill accident. After 6 months of treatment, Sarah was finally permitted to take Thomas home.
She wrote to her sister, "The man who returned to me bears Thomas's face, but his soul seems to have been hollowed out and replaced with something cold and strange. He performs simple tasks when instructed, but shows no recognition of our children or our life together. Dr. Theophilus assures me that this is temporary, that Thomas's mind is simply adjusting to its newly corrected state, but I fear something precious has been lost forever." The truth about Dr. Theophilus's methods was far more horrific than even his critics suspected. The doctor had become obsessed with the idea that mental illness was caused by physical pressure within the skull. His treatments involved drilling holes in patients' heads and inserting various instruments to relieve what he believed was excess cranial pressure. Most of these procedures were performed without any form of anesthesia, as Theophilus believed that the patient's conscious response to the treatment was essential for determining its effectiveness. He would later write in his private journals, "The patient's screams and convulsions provide valuable data about the precise location of the cerebral malformation. Only through their suffering can we map the geography of madness." When patients died during these brutal procedures, which happened with increasing frequency, Dr. Theophilus faced a problem. Deaths at medical facilities were supposed to be reported to local authorities, and too many deaths would inevitably lead to unwanted scrutiny. His solution was as practical as it was horrifying. He would simply make the bodies disappear. The basement of Blackwood Institute became Dr. Theophilus's secret cemetery. With Hans Mueller's assistance, he would bury failed patients beneath the floorboards of his treatment rooms. The bodies were wrapped in canvas and lime to accelerate decomposition and mask any odors. Over the years, as the death toll mounted, the entire basement floor became a hidden graveyard. To explain the disappearance of patients, Dr. Theophilus developed an elaborate system of lies. He would tell families that their loved ones had been transferred to specialized facilities in distant cities for advanced treatment. He provided fake addresses and promised that correspondence would be forwarded, though such letters never arrived. In some cases, he would claim that patients had recovered so completely that they had chosen to start new lives elsewhere, free from the stigma of their former mental afflictions. He would produce forged letters thanking families for their support, but explaining that the patients needed to sever all ties with their past in order to maintain their mental health. The community of Millhaven began to whisper about the strange goings-on at Blackwood Institute. Local residents reported seeing lights burning in the basement windows at all hours of the night, accompanied by sounds that were difficult to describe: rhythmic pounding, scraping noises, and, occasionally, screams that seemed to come from beneath the earth itself. Dr. Theophilus's behavior became increasingly erratic as the years passed. He was seen walking the grounds of the institute at night, carrying a lantern and muttering to himself in what witnesses described as multiple voices, as if he were having conversations with invisible companions. Some speculated that the doctor's own mind had begun to fracture under the weight of his horrific acts. The beginning of the end came in 1867, when a former patient named Jacob Morrison escaped from the institute and made his way to the sheriff's office in town. Morrison had been subjected to multiple procedures and bore visible scars from drilling operations on his skull. His testimony, though rambling and often incoherent, painted a picture of systematic torture and murder that shocked even the hardened lawmen. Morrison claimed that Dr. Theophilus had shown him rooms filled with human skulls, which the doctor used for his anatomical studies. He described seeing other patients who had been reduced to vegetative states by failed procedures, kept alive in basement cells like animals. Most disturbing of all, Morrison insisted that he had witnessed the burial of patients who had died during treatment, their bodies interred beneath the very floors where others would later be tortured. The sheriff organized a preliminary investigation, but Dr. Theophilus's reputation and connections initially protected him from serious scrutiny. Several prominent families had invested significant money in the institute and were reluctant to believe that their trust had been so catastrophically misplaced. However, the investigation gained momentum when Martha Whitmore came forward with her son Edmund's medical records, which she had secretly copied during a visit to the institute. The documents revealed the extent of Dr. Theophilus's experimental procedures and included detailed drawings of surgical techniques that appeared to have no basis in legitimate medical science. What do you think drives someone to commit such systematic cruelty in the name of science? The psychology of medical monsters like Dr. Theophilus continues to fascinate researchers today. Drop your theories in the comments below.
As more families began to speak out about their suspicions, Dr. Theophilus realized that his time was running short. In November 1867, residents of Mill Haven awoke to find Blackwood Institute engulfed in flames. The fire burned so intensely that it consumed the entire structure within hours, leaving only smoldering ruins and a basement filled with ash and debris. Dr. Theophilus and Hans Mueller were never seen again. Some believed they had perished in the fire, while others suspected they had used the blaze as cover for their escape. The truth would remain a mystery for more than half a century. The ruins of Blackwood Institute became a source of local legend and fear. Children dared each other to approach the site at night, claiming they could hear voices calling from beneath the ground. Adults avoided the area entirely, crossing themselves when they had to pass by on the road to neighboring towns. It wasn't until 1923, when the town decided to build a memorial park on the site, that the full extent of Dr. Theophilus's crimes was finally revealed. The construction crew's discovery of the buried remains sent shockwaves throughout Pennsylvania and beyond. Forensic examination of the bones revealed evidence of crude surgical procedures, confirming the worst fears about what had transpired in the basement of Blackwood Institute. The skeletal remains were identified through personal effects and dental records where possible. 17 victims were confirmed, though investigators suspected that more bodies might have been consumed by the fire or buried elsewhere on the grounds. The victims ranged in age from 19 to 62, representing families from across the region who had trusted Dr. Theophilus with their most vulnerable members. Among the identified remains was Edmund Whitmore, whose mother Martha had died years earlier, still believing her son might be living peacefully somewhere under an assumed name. Also found were Thomas Hartwell, the man whose wife had described him as being hollowed out after his treatment, and Jacob Morrison, the escaped patient whose testimony had first exposed the horrors of Blackwood Institute. The discovery prompted a broader investigation into the history of mental health treatment in America. Historians uncovered evidence that Dr. Theophilus was not an isolated case, but part of a darker pattern of experimental medicine that flourished in the absence of proper oversight and regulation. Dr. Cornelius Theophilus himself remained a phantom figure. Extensive research into his background revealed that his credentials from the University of Edinburgh were likely fraudulent, and his real identity remains unknown to this day. Some investigators theorized that Theophilus was an assumed name adopted by someone seeking to escape a criminal past in Europe. The case of Blackwood Institute became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unregulated medical experimentation and the vulnerability of society's most defenseless members. It prompted reforms in the oversight of mental health facilities and contributed to the development of modern standards for medical ethics and patient rights. But the legacy of Dr. Theophilus extends beyond policy changes and historical lessons. The families of his victims carried their trauma for generations, passing down stories of relatives who had simply vanished into the dark corridors of Blackwood Institute, never to return. The site where the institute once stood is now a peaceful memorial garden with 17 trees planted to honor the identified victims. A simple plaque reads, "In memory of those who suffered and died in darkness, that others might live in light." Visitors often leave flowers at the base of the trees, and local residents maintain the garden as a testament to the importance of remembering history's darkest chapters. Yet, questions remain that may never be answered. How many other patients died in Dr. Theophilus's basement laboratory? Were there other facilities where he practiced his horrific methods? And, perhaps most unsettling of all, how many other monsters like Dr. Theophilus operated in the shadows of 19th century medicine, their crimes buried so deeply that they remain hidden even today? The story of Blackwood Institute serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unregulated medical experimentation and the vulnerability of society's most defenseless members. It prompted reforms in the oversight of mental health facilities and contributed to the development of modern standards for medical ethics and patient rights. But the legacy of Dr. Theophilus extends beyond policy changes and historical lessons. The families of his victims carried their trauma for generations, passing down stories of relatives who had simply vanished into the dark corridors of Blackwood Institute, never to return. The site where the institute once stood is now a peaceful memorial garden with 17 trees planted to honor the identified victims. A simple plaque reads, "In memory of those who suffered and died in darkness, that others might live in light." Visitors often leave flowers at the base of the trees, and local residents maintain the garden as a testament to the importance of remembering history's darkest chapters. Yet, questions remain that may never be answered. How many other patients died in Dr. Theophilus's basement laboratory? Were there other facilities where he practiced his horrific methods? And, perhaps most unsettling of all, how many other monsters like Dr. Theophilus operated in the shadows of 19th century medicine, their crimes buried so deeply that they remain hidden even today? The story of Blackwood Institute serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unregulated medical experimentation and the vulnerability of society's most defenseless members. It prompted reforms in the oversight of mental health facilities and contributed to the development of modern standards for medical ethics and patient rights. But the legacy of Dr. Theophilus extends beyond policy changes and historical lessons. The families of his victims carried their trauma for generations, passing down stories of relatives who had simply vanished into the dark corridors of Blackwood Institute, never to return. The 17 trees in Memorial Garden continue to grow, their roots spreading deep into soil that once held such terrible secrets. They stand as living monuments to the resilience of the human spirit and the importance of bearing witness to truth, no matter how dark or difficult it may be. In the end, Dr. Theophilus succeeded in one thing he never intended. He created a lasting testament to the victims he tried so desperately to erase. Their story, finally told after decades of silence, ensures that they will never be forgotten again. If this journey into one of America's darkest medical mysteries has left you questioning what other secrets lie buried in our past, you're not alone. History's shadows hold countless stories of ambition turned monstrous and trust betrayed. Hit that notification bell to join our community of truth seekers as we continue excavating these buried chapters of human darkness, because understanding our past horrors is the only way to prevent future ones. What other medical mysteries from history do you think deserve to be brought to light? Share your thoughts below, and remember, some secrets are too important to stay buried.